Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the show. I've got Josh Scott with me in person again. He's my in-person guest. You're like the only person that does these with me in person. Listen, this is a weird episode because this episode is coming up from popular demand or like opposition. I'm not sure, but the people aren't asking for this, but we're giving it to them. So I interviewed Josh on Christian nationalism and just shared a couple of clips on Instagram, and a few of them have blown up. One of them in particular just has gotten, it went viral, but it's getting so much crazy activity in the comment section. So we were talking and we're like, we should do a follow-up episode to the Christian nationalism conversation because there was more that needs to be said culturally, societally, than we got to address. The feedback was really helpful. So we're doing a part 2 to that conversation. If you haven't checked out that first conversation, the link is in the show notes to check that out. So do check out that episode first. And then here we are to part 2 of that. So firstly, Josh, well, hang on. In case this is the first time anybody's seeing you, let's introduce you to them. Who are you?
Well, I'm Josh Scott. I am a writer and a pastor. My first book just came out like a month ago, almost.
At the recording of this.
There it is, Bible Stories for Grown-Ups. And it's out in the world. I'm about to start a book tour. On the 21st of May is the first actual book event. I'll be in Phoenix.
Nice.
I'm also a pastor of Grace Point Church in Nashville, a progressive Christian church. And when I talk about the work I do in the world, I talk about the idea of reimagining, reframing, and reclaiming faith through a progressive Christian lens.
Nice.
That's me.
Man, I need a better tagline. It's great. I love it. Okay, so here's the deal. There was some love, but mostly hate in the comment section of that reel of you talking about Christian nationalism in America. First, I want to ask you, Josh, what was it like reading the comments on that post for you? What came up?
I mean, I'm sure I know because I see some of your posts about it. Like, I get my fair share of love on the internet. I mean, I have people who say all sorts of things. Some of it always ends up being just ridiculous, right? Where like people are just write one word like stupid, and it's like, oh, thank you for the well-reasoned response. Some of it, it's interesting when people don't deal with just like the topic, but they just start attacking the messengers of the topic. And then some were way out there, like the guy who basically said that there's going to be a civil war and that his side's going to win. I don't know if you saw that one. That was a real doozy. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, it's one of those things that it's interesting that obviously it triggered something that people responded to really, really swiftly and with lots of
like viscerally.
That's the word I'm looking for. What's interesting about that, and of course, one of the things people really push back on is the idea that "Make America Great Again" as a slogan and idea is tied to the idea of racism. What I find fascinating is like when the idea of racism gets brought up into a conversation, people get really mad, as opposed to taking a beat and thinking, is there something there? Is there something to explore there? And I find that, like, what I would ask those commenters if I could sit down with each of them individually is like, hey, what's the anger about? Because anger is revealing. Like, what makes you angry tells you something.
That's true.
And so, like, if I get really, really angry that somebody cut me off in traffic, that's probably saying there's something simmering below the surface that I'm not dealing with.
But I've got a lot of things I'm not dealing with.
Yeah, me too. But it's just, it's sort of one of those things like follow the anger. What is this coming from? Because anger tells you what's going on with you. It tells you sometimes what you care about or what's unresolved. And so it's interesting to me that people, when the idea of racism comes up, like their initial response is, rah, as opposed to like curiosity. And I find that's true theologically too. Like when you present a different idea theologically, if the first response is anger and not, never thought about that. Now there's two ways to say that. There's the first way, which is, well, I've never heard it that way before, which means it can't possibly be true or worthy of engagement. Or there's, wow, I've never heard of that before. Maybe I need to think about what that might mean. And theologically, when that happens, what I find is it's really couched in fear. Anger often is deeply connected to our fears. And so when somebody gets mad when you present a different theological idea, it's probably related to some sort of fear. When people get mad when you bring up racism, it's probably rooted in some sort of fear.
Totally.
Because I think that there are folks who, I think some of those folks don't want to think of themselves as having racism in their life, right? I mean, nobody wants to think about that, but I mean, the truth is that's a reality that so many, almost everybody is working through some sort of process with, right? And instead of being able to acknowledge, gosh, there is an unknown implicit bias in me that I need to deal with, there's just ends up being anger, probably related to fear, probably related to all sorts of subterranean goings on.
Totally. Unfortunately, that's relatable. I know what that's like. So the thing that came up in this particular clip that brought up all this vitriol was you were talking about making America great again, right?
Mm-hmm.
And how, like, when was this country so great? The 40s, the 20s, right? And then you describe some of what our culture was like at those times in history for certain people groups, especially. And someone made a comment, well, you don't understand what make America great again means. We're talking about economically, right?
Right.
Like, would you care to respond to that?
Yeah, I would love to. Thank you for the invitation, Mike. I would love to. First of all, one of the comments I kept seeing a few people say is, well, we just want to go back to the 90s because the 90s were great. And look, I was in high school in the 90s, and there was so much the music scene in the 90s was incredible. Especially the mid to latter half of the 90s. But also, if you think back to the 90s, think about also what was still going on. You still had Don't Ask, Don't Tell. It still wasn't safe to be openly LGBTQ plus in most contexts. Think about where things stood in terms of the equality of women. I mean, it wasn't the 40s or 50s, but it definitely isn't. And we still got a long way to go today,
right? But
it still wasn't. And so I think that when we keep idolizing these times in the past, it's just, and I forget where I heard this, but nostalgia is a terrible leadership model. And nostalgia is a terrible compass, because nostalgia takes us back to what we think was comfortable and safe. And the reality is there's at any point behind us, there's a lot to learn and a lot more to do. And in this moment, there's a lot to learn and a lot more to do. So I think idolizing, romanticizing, being stuck, I'm going to quote you too, being stuck in a moment you can't get out of. It's never the way that creates human flourishing. It's about forward movement. To the comments about Make America Great Again being primarily an economic statement, I find it interesting in this country that there are a group of people who desperately want to say this is a Christian nation, and at the same time bow down at the altar of the economy. Which is it? And the reason I bring that up is because and this is one of those things Jesus talked about that we have in the Gospels. Jesus goes on record about greatness, because there's this scene in the Gospels where Jesus and his disciples are on a journey, and it's sort of, you get this image that he's in the front leading them, and they're kind of in the back having this whisper fight. You know, like my kids do this, like when they know that they're going to get, there's going to be consequences for just yelling at each other. Like you'll hear them in the back. Right. So a couple of disciples get in this debate about who among them is the greatest. And Jesus apparently eavesdrops long enough. And when they finally, get to a starting point, he redefines greatness for them. That, hey, this is how the world works. This is how the Gentiles do things, right? This is how the empire functions. It's about who you know. It's about power. It's about climbing the ladder. It's about having all of this stuff and all this economics. It's about having all the things and other people knowing how great you are. And then he gives them this powerful, not so with you. The greatest among you will be the servant, the person who cares for the needs of others, the person who lives in sort of this radical generosity and hospitality. So the idea that somehow this is a Christian movement, Christian nation, that also bows down at the economy for everything. I mean, the reality is people lose their lives over the economy, right? I mean, people lose everything. And the truth is the economy is a system we made up that now is acting against us and harming us. And the idea that it really doesn't matter what a person's character is, it doesn't matter how they treat people, it doesn't matter how the most marginalized and vulnerable are treated. All that matters is that the economy looks good and it seems like things are moving up and to the right. That's inhumane and it's unjust. And so if Make America Great Again means make billionaires comfortable, make the wealthy wealthier, if that's what Making America Great Again means, then that's still a terrible idea. Okay, you say it's not racist, it's still a bad idea, because it is still grounded in policy and perspective that is deeply unjust and does not care about the marginalized, the forgotten. It doesn't care about the sick. It doesn't care. So I find that particular defense, oh, you don't get it. Well, okay, let's say you're right. It's about the economy. It still stinks. Because, I find it really interesting when we read the Gospels. It seems like what Jesus is calling for is Jubilee, right? Jesus is calling for this radical forgiveness of debts. Yeah. Like Jesus in the Lord's Prayer, model prayer, teaches us to pray, forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors. And the word does not mean like trespass. It doesn't mean sin. He's not saying, well, if somebody sins again, forgive us in the way we forgive other people's sins. I think Jesus is praying literally, forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors. Because if Jubilee is going to start, it's going to start with us, I think is what Jesus is teaching us to pray. I posted that on social media, and the Christian pushback on the idea of debt forgiveness, that Jesus would call for that.
You're saying uniquely Christians were saying no to this.
Yeah, I mean, it's
for Christian reasons.
For Christian reasons.
But yeah, this is the reason. Do you remember?
Well, I mean, think about this. How many people, when they tried to enact this student loan debt forgiveness recently, how many people did you see on the socials angry because they paid off all their debts? How dare somebody else get something I'm not? I mean, it's tied to this idea of scarcity. It's tied to this, there's a certain jealousy component. The idea that somebody else may get something they don't infuriates them.
The grace idea?
Yeah. The idea of grace infuriates Christians. You heard it here first, but it's true, right? The idea of grace, and this is why I think grace ultimately is scandalous. It's scandalous because it cuts against what we've been taught, which is everything is about earning, everything is about deserving, everything is about if I get $5 forgiven, you get $5 forgiven, as opposed to what if we just wipe it all out, right? Like, and I think Jesus is calling for that. I think Jesus is calling for a radically different way of ordering the world. And by the way, that's why Rome crucified him. Not because he was a spiritual savior promising an afterlife experience, but because he was leading an alternative movement that was calling for the world to be run differently.
It was threatening the economy of Rome.
It's threatening the economy of Rome. Think about this, Mike. When they come up to Jesus and ask him, should we pay taxes to Caesar? What does he say?
Bring me a coin.
He doesn't have
one.
Look at all the times Jesus is asked about money in the Gospels, and he never has any. And when he's asked about the coin, he doesn't say yes or no to the tax question. He leaves it sort of to them to say, give to Caesar what is Caesar's and God what is God. What is in Caesar's image, this coin? What is in God's image? You, everything. But I think more than that, Jesus I think his movement is an opting out of the economic system of the empire, right? This is why when Jesus sends his disciples out, he says, don't take anything. Don't take bread. Don't take a purse. Don't take a staff when you go. And one of the texts, he says, take a staff, but one he doesn't. Mm-hmm. He sends them out on their mission, and they're dependent completely on the hospitality of the people they encounter, because that is what the kingdom looks like. Jesus is leading them. Think about the early church in the book of Acts. What are they doing? Everybody's sharing all their stuff. Nobody's going hungry. It's this radical. How do we counter Rome? We don't counter Rome by picking up swords and swinging them. They have way more swords and people than we do. How do we counter Rome? We set up an alternative kingdom with an alternative economy, with an alternative approach, and we begin to live that out. And I think Paul picked that up and did the exact same thing Jesus did, with the innovation that it wasn't just Jewish people the empire was hurting, it was also Gentiles in Corinth. And they bring together this movement of people in empire resistance to live differently in community with each other. I think Jesus is very much not only preaching a religious message and a political message, but as an economic message, because in the ancient world, they knew what we didn't, which is you can try all day to separate those things, but in the ancient world, they knew those are all three the same. If it's religious, it's political. If it's political, it's economic, because politics are about how we order our common life. So when people are like, hey, stop preaching politics, well, then I can't preach the prophets, and I can't talk about the Exodus, and I can't talk about Jesus, and I can't talk about the early church, because it's all about how we order our common life.
You can't even talk about the law.
Can't talk about anything.
Right, yeah.
Can't talk about anything.
Oh, God. Okay, two things. One, we need to pull you in physically.
Okay.
How do we get you more than? Okay, two, I have some questions coming up in my mind with the things you're saying. Firstly, let me confess, the stuff you're saying feels threatening. I love it and I hate it at the same time, right? I don't know that I hate it. I'm like, oh God, it's hard to like think about the future with some of these ideas because you're like, we've only ever known capitalism, right? Or, I've only ever been in this environment. I was raised very right-wing Republican in terms of the economy, right?
Well, just to say, I don't know what to do.
What?
No, I don't know I mean, I know what I think Jesus is advocating for.
But this doesn't sound like.
It doesn't sound, well, I think we see it in his movement. It doesn't sound, it sounds threatening. Okay. Because it threatens life as we know it.
Yeah. Yeah.
It threatens life as we know it.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm
like you're taking away what success even means for some of the people for people like me. Like, how do I, sorry, go ahead.
No, it's very much, I mean, if I talk about this in a sermon at church, I usually end with, I don't know what to do with this, but this is what I think is going on. And I don't even necessarily, I love it. And I also am terrified of it. Because when like the idea of us taking care of each other, the idea of nobody losing their life, the ability to eat or find housing, like that we actually would take care of other human beings who bear God's image, deeply resonates with me. Yeah. And at the same time, I'm like, oh, what does this mean for me and my ability to take vacation next year? Which I think reveals, I mean, again, this all goes back to where your treasure is, there your heart is. And it goes back to, why does the idea of greatness, why is it tied to economic success? Why is the measure of our greatness not how we're treating the most vulnerable among us? Because I think that's exactly what Jesus seems to be saying. That our greatness isn't in our ability to dominate other people, but it's actually in our ability to feed them, clothe them, care for them, heal them, all of that beautiful stuff.
Yeah. When you're saying these things, I can feel something in me getting shaken, but it's like a good shaking, like
shaken, not stirred.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Like pulling in a direction that like feels like liberation, feels humanizing, feels healing. And then you just run into all of this problem with your programming, right? Like all I've ever been taught, especially in school, like here's how you succeed, here's how you win, here's how you garner power and success and security and protect yourself, right? All that stuff. And you're like, oh my God, how much of my own framework and motivation in the economic side of my life is rooted in fear or scarcity, right? Like,
and I think right now what you're encapsulating is probably how many or most people felt hearing Jesus preach. This is not different time, different place, different context, just as scary, right? So I think, I would say you're not alone. And I think you would be right in line with anybody who ever heard Jesus proclaim these things.
Okay, let's answer this question if you can. I'm thinking of the people who are hearing this and being like, well, what if, or what about, right? All the things come up, right? But like, for example, one of the things I'm hearing from my grandpa, love my grandpa, right? Good man, all the things, very conservative fiscally and economically and politically, hard work. Right? If we do this idea that we're just going to forgive this stuff and give things out for free, the work ethic is going to decline. Who's going to do the things that, like what's going to happen to like the jobs and.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's, first of all, I think that really makes some assumptions about human beings and what we're like. I mean, if I won the lottery tomorrow, the next day I would go to work.
Because you love what you do.
Because I love what I do. Yeah. And imagine the idea of people being able to do what they love. What kind of world does that create? Does that make the world worse? Like when somebody's able to get engaged in what they love, I think the world gets a little bit better.
Would you say to that conservative voice, like, because the thing that's coming out with me is like, well, you might think that, or you might do that with the lottery, but other people won't. You would do that because of your character and your integrity and the discipline you've cultivated or whatever. Not everyone has that. So if they get given the same opportunity, they're not gonna choose contribution and labor. They're gonna, squander it or whatever, right? Like, what would you say to that in terms of human nature? If you're advocating for, I think naturally.
If you told me tomorrow that by taking care of people who were hungry or unhoused, that would be the turnout of it, I still think it's good to take care of people who are hungry and unhoused.
For how long? Right? That comes up. Like, how long do you do this for them before it becomes enabling and they're dependent on you and don't actually, right? Like that
I
question.
mean, I think that people are who they are and how they are for lots of factors. And when you're constantly spending all of your energy getting from this moment to the next, I think it becomes really hard to think about, what do I want to do with my energy? What makes me feel like I'm alive? What if I could do anything? I mean, when you're literally just going from one thing to the next. So, you know, I don't have I have no concerns that if we did, as a country, if we did the right thing and took care of our people, I have no concerns about how that would shake out.
You believe, can you fill in the blank? What would happen if we did all the things you're describing right now? Can you paint kind of a loose, if you can, picture of what you think would, or what would happen?
People would flourish. People would flourish. And I think you would actually experience a kind of unity that we try to make up in this country that happens when things are fractured. Let's go to war. That'll solve it. You know what I mean? Like if the only thing we can come around in this country is war, why can't we come around human flourishing? And maybe and I'm not saying I know exactly how to do it or how it should all work. I'm just telling you what I think Jesus was saying, right? Like this is my interpretation of Jesus' message. But I am saying, I think if we could figure out how in this country to create policy that the goal was not where the goal was human flourishing, I think that we would see a transformation of our society.
So there's this drive. It seems like there's a current of greed that it's not just enough, like to have enough to live their life and function, but we got to be the best. We got to keep taking and advancing and being the most fill in the blank. That has to happen.
Yeah, I mean, like I think when I hear these contracts professional athletes sign, right? Like $52 million over 6 years. Like, why do you ever need more money than that? When you hear something like somebody's a billionaire and they're still getting more money. And I know that, I mean, people are going to they're going to go off on this.
Yes, thank you for that.
They are, but I just like, I just find it, again, I find that to be starkly contrasting to what Jesus seems to be advocating for. And I'm not saying people can't believe that this right? They can believe like, get all you can, get all you can, get all you can. Just don't call it Christian. Don't say that that's the Jesus
like that could
perspective.
Be American, it's just not Christian.
Yeah. Yeah. And I still think it's unhealthy, but that is not what Jesus is advocating for. That is not the world of Jesus. Jesus is not, arguing like, hey, get all you can. And when you have all that you need and more that you need, get more. Like,
oh God. Oh, yeah. Listen, I just want to kind of react raw and fresh. I hate and love what you're saying at the same time.
Me too.
Like, there's a part of me that's like, yes, like there's a part of me that wants to believe this. And I mean, that believes this, I think is fair and wants to see it happen and not just like idealize it in my own heart, but like see us actually like take it seriously and practice it.
Yeah.
There's another part of me that's like, oh my God, what level of sacrifice and clunkiness and awkward and painful and whatever are we all going to have to go through to actually incorporate this into how much work is going to have to be done, right?
Right. But think about this. The idea that everybody would have, let's just create a fantasy world. Everybody has what they need, right? Let's create that. Let's dream that up, which I think Jesus is dreaming that world up. Why does it feel like a threat to us? Because it does to me too. Why does it feel like a threat to us? We're still going to have everything we need, right? Like, it's not like, well, all of a sudden now other people get this and you're left wanting. That's not the vision of Jesus. The vision of Jesus, everybody has what they need. Again, I'm not saying I know how to do this. I'm just saying this is what I think Jesus was up to.
Yeah.
And I as a Christian, I want to be as honest as I can, even when I find it frustrating, challenging. The more I dig into what I think the historical Jesus was about, the more frustrating it is. One, because it's not at all what the religion that claims to follow him is like. And two, it is hard. It's almost like there is a broad way that is easy and a narrow way that is difficult. If only Jesus had used that metaphor, it would be.
Hi, Mike here. I just want to make sure you know that I'm a coach and a consultant. I specifically work with people through their queer journey or their religious baggage, and there's a link below this episode if you want to work with me. All right, let's get back to the episode.
How you doing, Mike?
Fine. I feel fine. I feel bothered in a good way. I think these feelings, I'm like, you know what comes after these feelings, if they're given enough airtime, is like pain, you know? And it's not bad pain, it's like necessary for, you know, because it leads to healing and wholeness and whatever. But I'm like, I've done this a few times in my life, having to like consider something that was so radically different than everything I'd known and invested in. And then walking through like the grief and all the.
And it's also acknowledging the hypocrisy, right? Like, I sit here a hypocrite. I participate in an economic system that I think Jesus is opposed to. And it's been good to me. That's what I'm saying. That's what I'm saying. It's frustrating. It's challenging. And figuring out how I more and more can align myself with the path of Jesus is hard. I think it takes imagination. And I think it's an imagination we don't yet have. But I just don't buy that where we are in America right now is as good as it could possibly get.
I also don't buy that.
So, you know,
Jeez.
Yeah, we can't make America great again because we haven't gotten there yet. Because greatness is not measured in how much money we have or how many bombs we can build or how many guns every individual American can carry at one time on the street in front of everybody. I think greatness is ultimately measured in how we transform the world for human flourishing. And we've got a lot of work to do because I don't think humans are flourishing. And I get the frustration, the anger and angst that a lot of the folks who have supported Donald Trump have. A lot of them are people who grew up in contexts like I did. I grew up in Appalachia, right? I grew up in a place where people have struggled and they've struggled and government has forgotten them and not cared for them. The idea that a billionaire understands how they feel or actually thinks about them at all when he doesn't need them to vote for him. I mean, it's a bait and switch of epic proportions. But I get the frustration. We have not done right by our people. And, you know, I am about as anti-war as you can get. But this idea that we send young people over in places of combat, and then they come home and end up unhoused or don't have access to what they need, it is unbelievable. It is unbelievable. So, and I think that when maybe some of the reaction is, the anger and the reaction is thinking that maybe I'm being dismissive of the real pain and struggle that so many people have held and experienced. That's not it at all. I think America is failing so many of their citizens. I don't think the way to mitigate that is to put billionaires in charge and allow them to use hateful, divisive, unethical means to try to do something that has never, to try to take us back to some period that has never existed. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. That makes sense. So you said use the word imagination. I don't think something like we haven't developed that kind of imagination yet or something.
Yeah.
It does feel like in some of the areas of people that I follow, listen to, work with, there is this work of like upgrading our imagination, our ability to perceive of a future that our present denies or opposes. But like maybe it seems inconceivable right now, but if we don't even start imagining that direction or possibility, we'll never get there, right? It feels like some of the practical on the stuff you're describing right now is we're listening and being challenged and bothered and provoked. One of the steps is not the only thing, it's not enough, but one of the things we have to do is engage our imagination and be willing to consider, what if it doesn't have to be like this?
See, that's the thing. And one of the things that prevents that is when somebody puts out this idea, what if it could be different? And then everybody's like, because of the fear, right? You experienced it just now. I experienced it just now, that sort of fear, that almost anger and frustration. So we can't even say, hey, imagine, because then people are like, no, just stop that. Nobody's doing it right now. Nobody's changing anything. Lord, God, changing anything in this country takes eons. But what if we were just to sit down and say, let's imagine the best case scenario for America. What does that look like? Now, there are probably some really mean, hateful, nasty, vindictive, racist, phobic people bigots who will imagine a country that works for them and punishes and stifles everybody else. I don't think that that's maybe everybody. I think that there are some people who have just never been given the ability to imagine, what if we all could be taken care of? What if everybody had the access to the healthcare, the mental health care? What if everybody had access to what they need to thrive as a human being? And what if they didn't have to like lose their house and skip meals in order to pay for things like healthcare? Like what if? And if we can't even begin to what if what ifing is off limits, and you and I both grew up in theological systems where what ifing is off limits, because the what if is a threat. And what makes it a threat is it begins to undermine, it puts the idea in people's heads that, what if? Maybe it doesn't have to be this way. And I think that's some of what you're dealing with Jesus, right? He gets people into the area of what if the world could be different? And what if we could, in our own little, like, here's what Jesus doesn't do. He doesn't say, I'm gonna go implement this by force on the whole world. He begins with, we're going to begin, the kingdom is here. This is the message. The kingdom of God is here. How do you know? Well, because nobody is hungry. People are being healed. People are being liberated. The world's being transformed. We're doing it right here. And it's going to spread. That's what he says, right? Like, you just take a little bit of yeast and work it in the dough, and then you plant a little tiny seed, and I think that's what you see with the early Jesus movement. Again, I think in one of the previous videos we talked about, that's why Rome co-opted Christianity or created Christianity. All right, because the Jesus movement was actually working. It was undermining what the empire was doing. It actually got people to believe, what if it could be different? And to those who are really comfortable with how the world works, who are benefiting from how the world works, the what if can be the most terrifying 2 words in any human language.
Like want to hug you and punch you at the same time.
People often have that experience. Some people don't even want to hug.
Yeah. Okay, great. So I forgot this is part of what it's like talking to you. I'm going to put that in my heart bag, and I'll be unpacking that and pulling it apart. I want to ask you, for the sake of this conversation and for the people listening, watching, when it comes to the MAGA thing, Make America Great Again, person's like, one of the people was like, hey, it's not about whatever, it's about the economy. Let's put that on hold. We talked about that a bit. What about the racist side of Make America Great Again? Like, do you have some commentary you'd like to provide on, like, is Make America Great Again, that slogan, that movement, the people who are part of that, like, love that? Is there racism in that message? Yeah.
I think that, I know Ron DeSantis is not going to like this, but there's racism throughout the entire system. Just exists. Yes, there's racism. I mean, here's why. Like, look at some of the groups of people who end up being attracted to this. My general ideology is, if I'm saying something and Nazis are getting fired up and excited about it, I'm probably on the wrong side. If it causes people in khaki pants to march across a college campus screaming, "You will not replace us," probably on the wrong side. I think it's undeniable that Donald Trump's message has resonated with some groups of people who represent the very worst of our country in terms of how they feel about other people, in terms of bigotry, in terms of phobia, in terms of racism. I think that's undeniable. And maybe that's part of the anger. Maybe some people don't want to be associated with those groups. And if that's the case, run. You don't have, there are other ways of talking about improving this country and our economy than aligning yourself with an ideology that appeals to people that you don't want to be associated with. You don't have to be. And maybe the economic system as it is has been harmful to you. Maybe you've been run over and forgotten. Maybe Republicans have failed you, and maybe Democrats have failed you. But the solution is not to align yourself with groups of people who are doing harm to others. There are ways of approaching this that would lead to your benefit and the benefit of everyone else without aligning yourself with those camps.
So you're saying the solution is for people to be Democrats?
No. Look, depends on what the options are. No, I mean, I have issues with Democrats as well. I don't think that either of our political parties right now has the moral courage to put forth a vision for the country that actually works for everybody, that brings about societal transformation. It takes a great. Now, I think we do have some politicians who have at least a little bit of the energy that they want to see things change and be different, but they kind of get lost in the shuffle and gridlock that is Congress.
Most of the people getting on board with MAGA, that whole, political movement or idea or whatever. Generally, it seems like most people I see touting that, wearing the merch, whatever, are white, right? Like it seems to be a pretty strong demographic representing that idea. They also tend to be Christian, right? Like I don't want to just generalize and swoop, but I have a lot of interactions online, especially of people who are coming from the MAGA crowd. And if I look at the people who slide in my DMs or the comment sections and are being horrible, specifically against the queer community, their accounts, like almost, I want to say 8 or 9 times out of 10, it's like Trump, it's an American flag, it's a Confederate flag. There's always this appropriation of the American idea, and MAGA tends to also somehow be peppered within this whole mess. And also like lover of Jesus, follower of Jesus, right? Like husband, father, lover of Jesus, whatever. I'm like, why is this a recurring thing? I guess I want to poke at these people are claiming Jesus, and you and I were talking before this, and you mentioned like there's a Jesus that people believe, worship, follow, claim, whatever, that never existed.
Yeah.
Do you want to?
Yeah. I mean, I think that the Jesus so many of us have been handed, sold, convinced of is not the Jesus who existed. Right? It's a Jesus of our imagination. It's a Jesus of 4th century, 16th century, whatever imagination, theological interpretation. But it's not the Jesus who in history went around proclaiming the kingdom of God, doling out free healthcare and meals, liberating people from oppression, forgiving debts, forgiving everything, and resisting the empire as a unjust system of brutality. I mean, the idea that it's interesting that when we see people protesting and non-violently protesting, when they're protesting for gun reform, when they're protesting against police brutality, when they're protesting for access to healthcare, all of those things, there's a certain response from some people, like they're just troublemakers. What was Palm Sunday? I mean, in some way, and what was the temple action? It's this protest, because the message that Jesus is presenting is disruptive to the way things were. And so if we're not creating nonviolent disruptions, if like I even look at my work as creating theological disruption, because there is
you do that.
Thank you. I try. Here's why, because there is a dominant message and framing and understanding of Jesus and the Christian faith that exists in this country, and I don't think it's very good. I don't think it's actually encapsulates who Jesus was. And I think it's created a lot of trauma and a lot of harm, and it's done a lot of damage to a lot of people. And I don't think that's, I think the Jesus that's being thrown around, touted, and used to harm people didn't exist. But I believe Jesus existed. And I believe the historical Jesus was, I think if you walked in the room, I think a lot of people who are Christian would be like, I'm out. Like, let him give the sermon one Sunday.
Just let him talk once.
Attendance plummets.
Yeah.
And so I think disruption can be holy.
Yeah, necessary. Can you say a little more about this notion, this idea that Palm Sunday was a protest?
I think it was a lampoon.
What do you mean by that?
I think he's lampooning.
I don't know what that word means.
Poking fun a little bit.
Oh,
showing how ridiculous Roman power structures were, because essentially it's a mockery of the way a Roman emperor would enter the city, or a Roman governor would enter the city. Right? They come in on war horses with soldiers and weapons. And here comes Jesus on a donkey with his followers waving palm fronds, proclaiming him king, essentially.
So like if a modern day dictator were to roll in with tanks and like armored cars and whatever, and then Jesus rides in on like a moped. Is that kind of a comparison?
Yeah, or a Schwinn,
Okay.
a Huffy, not even a 10-speed. You know what I mean? Like just basic model. I mean, there's also the gospel writers are brilliant, and they're wink, nudge, nudge, wink, wink to like Zechariah and some things that are written in the Hebrew scriptures. And I tend to think Palm Sunday, some version of it, was likely a historical event, that actually Jesus did this. And I think that Jesus very well may have done it with the scripture from Zechariah in mind. There's no way to know. They don't have a time machine.
Wow. Fascinating. Okay, so I want to maybe ask you this question and we'll end this plane. For the people who are listening, who a lot of what you're saying right now is like, whoa, what are you talking about? Specifically when it comes to Jesus, what are some ways that Jesus, the imagination Jesus of today, especially like white Christian nationalism, that Jesus, what are some things that Jesus is accredited for or used to perpetuate today that you're like, hey, here's what I'm talking about? If you want to, if you get explicit for people of it, just acknowledging, this is what it looks like.
The idea that Jesus would be pro AR-15. That the same Jesus who's like, put away the sword. If you live by the sword, die by the sword. Like 2,000 years later, he's like, yeah, give away an AR-15 to church on Easter. Churches do this all the time. They give away, they give away.
What?
I promise. Go just look it up on the internet. Churches,
like as a raffle or something?
Yeah, or a fundraiser or whatever, like a prize. Hey, we'll get people to come to church this week because we're going to give them weapons. I mean, just the idea that Jesus would be for that. I mean, Jesus has been used as an excuse. Jesus has become the poster child for every bigotry, bias, and hate that America has perpetuated for our entire history. Jesus was, I mean, essentially Jesus, God, scriptures are used to defend enslaving people, segregation, keeping people from equal rights. It's been used to justify the oppression of women. It's been used to justify the hatred and oppression and abuse and even killing of LGBTQ plus people. At the core of all that, people have created a version of Jesus that then, it's interesting when Jesus told his disciples, take up your cross, he didn't mean and go put other people on them. When Jesus said, take up your cross, he's saying, do this work and do it nonviolent. Be willing to be crucified. Do not be willing to crucify. There's a difference. And I think we have large swaths of Christianity today, especially in the United States of America, that are willing to put people on crosses, but they aren't willing to pick them up instead.
Well, that's horrible. Ew, and true. Okay, Josh, my God, this is going to be a really fun episode for me to publish. And people are going to just like love it.
Nobody will have any problems with any of it. It's just...
Thank you for saying these things. I appreciate being challenged and threatened and inspired and all the things. It's like really important. Yes. Can we take a moment to talk about this book?
Yeah.
By the way, is there like a title for your tour?
Yeah, I'm calling it the Flannel Graph Tour.
I knew that. That's awesome.
Yeah.
I was like, when you said earlier, like you called yourself a hypocrite, I'm like, what if you just called your tour hypocrite?
That'll be a next.
Yeah. Tour two. Anyway, tell us about this book that you just released.
It's called Bible Stories for Grown-Ups. It is essentially a book that offers, so many of us were taught the Bible. I was taught it on a flannel graph in the basement of a cinder block church building in a holler in Eastern Kentucky in the 1980s. So that's where I'm from.
Nice.
And so many of those stories, I talk about it in the book. We even had I never remembered her name. She ran a program called Morning Stars. I called her Miss Morning Star. I couldn't remember her name, but she used to come to our public school like once a week and do an assembly where she would flannel graph a Bible story and teach us songs. And we'd sing songs.
Wow.
Right.
Wow.
And so much of the Bible got into my imagination that way. And here's, what began to happen is I started noticing when I got into college and I started reading the Bible educationally, right? Like for school, and that everything I'd been taught, like I was taught to read, right? But it wasn't just like I was first taught letters, and then those letters started being put together to make words, and those words started making sentences, and those sentences started making paragraphs, and then I'm reading books, right? That my experience with the Bible didn't build. It wasn't like, here's a lens to see this as a kid, but you're going to grow, and then we're going to help you see the more challenging bits, and we're going to ask bigger questions, and we're going to learn context. And I was never given that until I was in college. And so in this book, what I try to do is say, look, as grownups, we need to approach the Bible like grownups. We need to ask questions of context and how these scriptures play within the world around them, and so I'm trying to tease out the challenges that have been in these stories all along. We just haven't been given ears to hear, eyes to see, and we haven't been given the tools to approach it. And so I deal with 6 stories in the book, 3 from the Hebrew Bible, 3 from the New Testament, and just offer what I think is a grown-up treatment. It was so much fun to write, and I'm so excited that people are reading it. If you watch this podcast and you think, I don't like that guy and I would hate that book, just buy it and burn it. It still counts as a sale.
Okay, the people who don't feel that way, what are you hoping readers are going to get out of this book? What are you hoping they walk away with?
So, I had a few things in mind for some people, just giving them an additional way of approaching these stories because they love the Bible and they just are interested in going deeper, right? For others, there are people who have been so harmed by the Bible, and it's been weaponized and used against them. It's giving them a little window into the Bible has been, and if there are people who are like, the Bible's been used against them and they're done with it, I believe the pastoral response for me is to say, that's okay.
Fist bump.
Go be healthy. Go do what you need to do to be well.
Yeah.
But what I find a lot of times, there are those people, but a lot of people feel like the Bible has been weaponized against them, taken from them, and they have grief. And what I hope I'm doing in this book is to those who are grieving the loss of the Bible is a very small step of saying, you can have it back. And actually the way it was used against you and the way it was interpreted against you is really, really not just a bad thing to do to the human being. It's a really bad interpretation. It doesn't take the Bible seriously enough. And so, I hope that's what happens in this. And I'm excited to go out and talk about it starting the 21st this month.
Nice.
I'm going to be all over the place.
Right. How do people find out where you're going to be? And
I'm posting that on I have a website being built right now, so that's not around yet. But I have my social media. I'm Josh_A_Scott on Instagram and Twitter, and I'm posting all that. You can find me on Facebook too.
Yeah.
And I have a site, joshascott.online, where I write and do some podcasts and some videos and that sort of thing. And I'll probably post it on there once it's finalized. I have a couple more dates I'm lining up.
When you say your website's not done yet, is it still going to be at Josh?
No, it's going to be on a different domain. Okay. I'm trying to figure out what I'm going to do with dueling websites, but I had this one first and we're doing something else with another one. So.
Okay, great. Well, so when that's ready and available, it'll be announced in your spaces.
Yeah. And people smarter than I am are sorting it out.
Right. Brilliant. Okay, great. Well, we'll put the links we do have in the show notes below so you guys can all go find Josh and access what he's doing there. Really important person to be following, listening to, engaging with. Obviously, we've got some imagination muscles to be flexing and working out. Josh is going to be a helpful fitness trainer in that area, prodding and expanding our capacity to even consider those things. So Josh, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me again.
For sure. I hope we do it again after
this. My gosh. I dare not dream.
Thank you for the work you're doing in the world. I mean, I say this all the time, but it's still true. Like, I love that you're saying the things you're saying. You have the boldness and the willingness, and that you hold the space in the world that you do in this way. It's like super important, and I appreciate it so much. Thank you for sure. All right, guys, thanks for being here. We'll see you in the next episode. Thank you for watching. As always, the pertinent links from the episode are below. I also have coaching and consulting available for you, as well as facilitated groups you might be interested in. You can find information about any of that with the first link below. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.